Thank you so much. I'm actually joining you from Gothenburg in Norway, in Sweden today. I'd normally be on lovely Ngunnawal country, but for the next couple of weeks, I'm visiting Europe. So I apologise. I did very much want to be there in person, but I'm currently working, as part of an international conference on data archiving while I'm here, so that took me away. That's also prevented me from attending, other sessions in the workshop as a whole because of it falling in the middle of the night. So I will do the best I can to engage here. It's about 5:30 in the morning Gothenburg time, and look to see how to talk to. Some of the considerations that I've want to bring to bear here. So let me just share screen briefly. I have a presentation to bring into the mix here. I'll just return to the start here, just so and switch my format so that everyone can get the full screen. Okay, so I've been thinking a little bit about what to speak about over the last couple of days, in particular, just to give colleagues a sense of my involvement here. I'm Steve McEachern. I'm the director of the Australian Data Archive at ANU, and I've also been involved in an advisory role, the ANU of the Indigenous Data Network, and some of the local operations, and some of my colleagues, I think, are either there in the room or online with you, working particularly with Len Smith and Sam Provost on this. And partly what I wanted to do today is kind of reflect on some of the implications of the breadth of the network that we're likely to see occurring through the IDN, and some of the design considerations that are going to come as a result of that, to give some thought about what that might mean for the sorts of support and interaction we need to manage across the network as a whole. So really, to say, I'm really thinking here about, let's say, we've federated data assets. I know, yesterday some of the team talked to you about the shared data catalogue that's in development. Nick Carr and the Surround team, in conjunction with the technical group, were talking to that. I'm partly thinking a little bit today about the other end of this is, what's the breadth of systems and infrastructure that we're have to be thinking about and dealing with, and possibly developing as we go through the sort of the development of this network, and what that might mean for some of the communications and strategic choices that need to be made as this moves forward. So sort of the overview, and I'll say I will come back to this at the end, that I kind of wanted to touch on here is the breadth of design choices that we in a sense have going on here, and possibly some of the implications that are there. And I'm going to reflect upon some of these in the context of the work I do at the Australian Data Archive, not to prioritise that as a particular collection, but just to point out how we've thought about these, and across network members, what are the implications for the your participation as a member of the network, possibly as a manager or a coordinator of collections as a whole, and then for bringing a lot of this together within the shared catalogues and systems that we're talking about there. So some of the things I really want to touch upon here, and I'll just be conscious of time here, simply, what are the governance and collaborative arrangements? How do we, what's the breadth of collection organisation and management that's and the means through which that's likely to be occurring across network partners? What are, thinking particularly about the role for standardization and to enable integration and coordination of services. I want to talk a little about the idea of, and I say this is a label I've given to this, of X-ready data, which is, what is the the data that we're talking about actually intended to be used for. So do we have content organized and enabled in such a way that it suits the purpose for which we're looking to bring it together and share it. And then particularly, I wanted to come at the end to think about the implications of distributed collections and the sort of the breadth of knowledge and the breadth of options that are likely to exist across the network. And how do we think about accommodating those considerations? Okay, so just to give you a little bit a quick background on ADA. We've been around since 1981, based at the Australian National University, and we work particularly in the social science research domain. So working to support and to preserve research data on behalf of the social science research community. We have about 1,500 data sets within our collection, and particularly prioritised around social, demographic, economic collections and the like, of different types collected over that period, and really focused into social sciences, population health, business and economics, and these spaces, and a little bit into some of the humanities. We also manage, content that's sourced actually from a range of sources on behalf of the custodians and data owners of those data. So from a mix of academic, government, and private sector providers. We don't do a whole lot with community sector and particular communities, but we have, in collaboration with some groups, started to do a bit of work in this space as well. And part of my reflection today is just starting to think about what we've learned a little bit over the last couple of years in working with a couple of community efforts as well through some academic colleagues here at ANU. Okay. So, as I said, my aim really today is to sort of just put it, up front on the table, what are some of the challenges that are likely to be associated with creation, management, discovery, and dissemination of data across the IDN network, and how to, I'm not providing answers on how we how we can deal with all these things, but really to think about are there some design choices and also some capacity and capability building our efforts we might put in place to support the breadth of the network as it exists, given the three streams of work that are occurring within IDN. So, first and foremost, I kind of want to start to the foundation on governance and collaboration, and I know we've had some of the speakers already talking to core governance types of issues, and I think particularly the previous speaker, for example, thinking about GDPR considerations, but different governance models that are there. I say the ADA has worked for a long time to try and support governance models of all different types. So, we work a lot, particularly with government agencies, with academics, and we did do a little bit of work several years back on, particularly with the ATCEDA group based at the University of Technology, Sydney, on Indigenous governance as well. Although I say that work has been we haven't done a lot on that for a while, but certainly thinking towards where the different points at which governance starts to come into the equation here. I kind of wanted to introduce that there are going to be implications of the different governance models at kind of three different levels really, and I'll use the terminologies of data sets, collections, and infrastructure here. Data sets really being the sort of the files and formats and things like that. Collections being at the level of an organized set of data sets within within a larger holding, but with often a core theme and a core set of custodian or ownership and intellectual property rights that might adhere to those, and then also at the level of the infrastructure as a whole. And that's kind of where my thinking tends to focus. Is I have to be able to as operating an infrastructure for ADA, how does that align with what needs to occur to support those lower levels of activity? How do we enable that without and coordinate that across the breadth of collections that we have? So at the level of in a sense data sets, so say you may have different terminology, but simply at the file or collections of files level, the sort of the starting the core question there is really thinking about how do you manage access to data at that level. And the governance questions are really is how do you fundamentally how do you enable and approve access to those collections within your custodianship. So say ADA supports different models. We actually don't own any of the data that sits inside of our collection. What we have to do is certainly manage arrangements and coordinate arrangements that are going to be consistent with the access, the governance model that the custodian has actually determined, and that has some interesting implications when it comes to the how we the sorts of resources that that are required to support those governance arrangements. We try to embed those a lot in the technical systems that we develop, but there are certainly humans on the ground involved in that access management process as well. Increasingly, there's some of the questions that come along with that is, and I noticed a number of government colleagues and academic colleagues working with linked and integrated data is dealing with the interaction of authority of bringing content together, and that's certainly becoming quite an administrative and challenge as thinking about the responsibility and authority for those and determining decision making of those. There are also some of the traditional methods that we might have used for making judgments and decisions about suitability of access when you bring those different assets together have changed some of the evaluation principles that might occur for a custodian. One example of that, being the sorts of anonymization methods that had occurred in the past with statistical data are no longer sufficient when you can start bringing more and more types of content together. So federating content is a good idea here, but it has increasing implications for particularly privacy and confidentiality concerns there, but possibly also for other sensitivities. It may expose cultural or commercial IP considerations as well. Sorry, I'm partly having to deal with Zoom when I go into a full screen, presenting different things on the screen to me. At the same time, you say there is also a second sort of consideration there as to what do you, and when I come back to sort of data management sort of questions here, but data formats and the different types of data holdings that you have mean that people are going to specialize in certain areas, and particularly as some of these services develop, we're likely to see specialized services for particular types of data. So how do you facilitate collaborative service development across different types of data that you might see there, and then overlay the governance structures across that? So as we the collaboration occurs, the governance models that have to come with that, both for linking data together and just simply enabling access, but linking it and possibly diversifying the collections, add to those governance layers increasingly. I want to just move up, a couple of levels to the to think about different, sort of high levels of governance and collaboration. So at the partly thinking about collections. So if you're operating a collection, this may be for a given community or a given custodian. Do you have collections policy that provide oversight on what you support, and but similarly, well, what do you not support? So what are the physical and digital? Do you make choices about physical or digital collections? For digital collections, how do you choose? So the proliferation of digital data means that you have challenges on what often large volumes of content. How do you select what's going to be there? How do you effectively actually make your way through the sets of content that's there? I reflect on that particularly from some work we did with the ARDC group several years back on some image collections where we had a proliferation of large volumes of image data where the curation and accession questions were challenging because simply of the volume of images that we had to deal with, not for the purpose of storage, but just to be able to catalog them effectively. But at the same time, also this was actually a collection that had originally been established through Facebook, and then there were intellectual property considerations that came to that as well. So how they might have been stored in the past and the provenance of those made it actually add an additional layer of complexity there. So at the collection level, what's your role of your different advisory committees and custodian groups? And potentially what's the role of different forms of institutions, and both what's the role they have to play, but also what are the institutional structures and arrangements that exist that may facilitate but also hinder potentially the types of collections management and governance approaches that come along with those. Different organizational types have different means through which they can work and operate. And then lastly, at the level of infrastructure is, and I say this is partly where where I come to from the point of view of ADA is, well, at the operation of the service as a whole, what again, what's in and out here? So what models of management and governance, what types of storage and analysis of data, what sorts of tools and metadata services are you willing to support or accommodate or enable? So what's the breadth of the service that you're there, and be able to say, well, what's in and out for you as a service? And here's where the value of a collaborative network certainly starts to come to the fore, because it might be the case that rather than supporting a particular type of activity or particular type of data collection yourself, there are those that have a better home for the content that's being discussed, and be able to coordinate and feed things to other members of the network may be of benefit there. Those sorts of data set governance rights become important in systems design at the infrastructure level. So for example, privacy, custodian ownership requirements, how do you build those in is one of the issues that I've got at the moment, and increasingly computational considerations come to play. So to sort of put in simple terms, both scalability and security of the data is something that I think some of the existing, particularly academic infrastructures, haven't supported all that well. They're often designed either to scale up or to manage security, but at some point we will actually have to start thinking about dealing with both. It's not so much of a consideration for right now, but when you get into, for example, analysis of social media as an example, but also complex computational modeling, Demographers, I know, certainly have had these sorts of questions as well. The interaction of large scale and sensitive data has kind of created limitations on what can be done, and people providing looking at workarounds to accommodate both of those dimensions has been an issue. I say it's not a broad brush issue, but as things sort of grow in size and complexity, it will increasingly come to the fore. So, in terms of sort of those are the sorts of governance considerations that that tend to cross over when I engage with different communities and different organisations in managing collections that certainly that come into our mix. There's also the question of that you often will end up with different styles of collection, and from the point of view of a collections manager or a service provider, infrastructure provider. One of the considerations there is, what can you support and what level of support are you able to provide, and how do you determine the appropriate distribution of resources to manage those collections? And they're going to again vary in size and complexity, but also in terms of the governance structures that are in place do have implications for the relationship you need to have with the custodians and the content that you're supporting. And this is something of an artificial kind of distinction I've made here. I'm going to elaborate this a little bit, but the sort of larger or collections often are going to have some more focused collection development. There's some of the consideration is thinking about where are you focusing your efforts fundamentally. So do you have focused collection development possibly in collaboration with the custodians or providers? How do you deal with the breadth of collections that you might be thinking about in academic and library worlds? Is often talked about long tail collections. You get large heavy use collections, but the smaller individual collections still have value. But the sort of resourcing you can put into those might differ. And as I say, how do you interact with different community collections as well? Is certainly going to be there's some design choices you might have to make there as well, particularly if they're where are they hosted and how are they hosted. And I'll come back to technology considerations as we go through. So sort of again trying to reflect upon those experiences working with those different collections at ADA. We've got kind of three variations. A lot of our effort does go into what we would describe our major collections. And this is those that fundamentally have the heaviest use and the highest demand. So we try to focus our value adding on those those collections that are probably going to be have the heaviest requirements and access requirements going along with them. So in our case, that's particularly focused around what's known as longitudinal panel studies. So there's a variety of those, including relevant to this group, the longitudinal study of Indigenous children, LSIC there. It's a study run by the Department of Social Services, but particularly building up a set of activities around longitudinal cohort studies and panel studies. We've progressively, continued to add new support for some of those longitudinal studies over time. And so as you build up expertise in an area, often you'll actually bring together a series of related content effectively. We've also got a role supporting census data. This was a long-term, with actually long-term storage for one of the old census tabular collections from the ABS, and also some cross-national studies. So those are the kind of the heavy lifting data sets that we tend to spend the most time in, on inside the ADA. But as I say, as a group interested in, sort of spreading, responsibility and activity, how do we support individual collections of, often smaller scale, and might often be by individual researchers or small research teams as well? How do we accommodate those effectively without it overwhelming our resources? So, if we're thinking about collections management, how do you deal with the breadth of content? And this is this choice about what the collections policy is, does have implications for the sort of resources there. So in our case, with some of those smaller collections, what we've tried to do is improve the capacity for self-management of those collections. So particularly user-driven self-deposit. We did work on our systems to streamline that. It might be working with groups of like-minded, of related projects to enable them to self-deposit. We've had a couple of examples of that, including a group at Melbourne University, in the Graduate School of Education. The SOCI project I've got listed there was a collaboration with the Graduate School of Education on about half a dozen small qualitative collections where we could develop collaboratively a set of policies that they've been able to apply in other cases as well. So sometimes, it might be trying to build thematic, around a type of data or an area of common interest, and so to jointly develop some of the support models there. But fundamentally, having to think about how do we enable sort of local capability to manage those collections. And then, progressively, one of the choices we make as we go through is thinking about value adding as we see higher demand going on. As things tend to be picked up more, looking at additional service we can put around that. In terms of community collections, I think, and I'm reflecting here a little bit on, say, three projects we've done with at CEDA, several years back, and Len Smith was heavily involved in that activity as well, with one or more remote communities to look at supporting some of the data assets that they developed, and that included on Groote Eylandt and Dilacqua, and the Return, Reconcile, Renew group at ANU, working with a number of communities. Some of the experiences, then I'll come back to the technology choice there, but there are real implications of being out on country, thinking about where data's stored, what are the how do you manage an approvals and access process for those? How do you deal with the fact that communications simply doesn't support certain technology choices that you might want to make? And we did discover that particularly with the RRR project there. So as we build support for community collections, some of the traditional models that have been used in some of by the infrastructure providers simply aren't going to work. And it's one I'll come back to at the end of the talk today. So I'll just pick up on three areas that probably are of broadly of challenge in the social sciences, and just to highlight those. And there are others on the call and in the room who are better positioned to talk to these. But the three that we find interesting challenges for that we're trying to think about going forward are certainly understanding and working with data linkage studies, and that can be various some of those longitudinal studies into administrative data, administrative collections themselves, social media and real-time data. It's likely the case that ADA won't certainly isn't looking to work directly to support those. We're looking to partners, the Digital Observatory and the Australian Social Data Observatory, It's one I haven't got on the list there. Again, probably concentrated areas of expertise are going to be relevant for certain styles of content, and systems for accessing sensitive data collections, whether that's personal, the personal sensitivity, cultural sensitivity, or commercial sensitivity, is a pretty active theme as well, and one that's not. I say there's quite a lot of work going on, and there's a number of providers establishing services and systems, but there isn't really a coordinated effort around support for different types of sensitive data services. I'm working on a project called Cadre, which is really around coordinated access to some of those systems, and the diversity of offerings that exist there, and we're talking particularly around secure laboratory services, remote access services, and the like, are quite varied. So I think there probably needs to be some concentration in that space. And I raise that partly because some of these facilities are an interesting way of dealing with challenges around sensitivity of content. If you're going to enable, where things are and who's using them, you can deal with some of the governance concerns, I think. But let's say they have to be accessible, and they have to be, kind of streamlined in the way that you can get to them, and that's that varies, and that the level to that's the case. I'll skip over this. I want to say one of the models that's being used, for that, for managing that, and it has its criticisms, but certainly the 5 SAFEs model is one means for thinking about the interaction of those technology and the governance models that are there, and this is the one that's certainly come through the recent Data Access and Transparency Act passed a couple of months back. Certainly looks at trying to think about safe people, safe projects, some basically a risk management model for thinking about access. Now, this is in the Australian context has been designed for thinking about access to data within custodianship of the Commonwealth. I do think there's an interesting an interesting case for actually thinking about whether you could turn this around a little bit from the point of view of thinking about access to community held collections. There's no reason that this necessarily needs to actually be a model that is access to government data and controlled by government custodians. I think if you turn this around and said, well, what if I was a government agency or an academic researcher looking for access to a community collection? Could I apply the same types of principles to be thinking about that? So I put that up as a way of, there's actually been quite a detailed amount of thinking about this as a model for managing access to administrative data collections. But I think that sort of the risk management sort of questions from the point of view of a community organisation, it is a framework that I think could be applied there as well, and has interesting implications for those who might otherwise have thought that the access might have been more streamlined than in the past. That how do we set a possible set of rules and and expectations around that? I'll go for time. Okay. I'll move through quickly a couple of other areas for consideration, and then I want to come back to the idea of what are the implications for distributed community as well. One, in terms of managing those collections, the sorts of considerations we have around data management. I've talked a bit about different formats and types. They do have implications for the sorts of systems you set up and the sorts of things you need to do to preserve and maintain that content, and to actually enable effective access to them as well. How do we manage the context and the provenance of the content that's coming through? Ideally, and this from the point of view of a network, how do we standardize? I've just listed some standards that we use in the domains that I work, but particularly to support an interactive network, an integrated network. How do we describe time, temporal, geographical, and conceptual elements of the content that people have under management. So what are the means through what is the base, but time and geography, time and space are particularly a challenge here, but conceptually, what are the interests that we're and the knowledge we're trying to represent. And I know Stephanie and talked yesterday about TK labels as one example of a representation of that. But I say on the bottom of both of these, it's the point is what are you trying to enable there? So that standardization doesn't need to think about why is it, why are you doing this? So to what ends are we, and for what purpose are we trying to standardize? Because that kind of helps to determine the sorts of standards and interactions you might want to achieve. At the same time, as say, enabling access to data, and say there's various reasons you might want to be thinking about that. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but the enabling access is going to be for different purposes as well. It's going to be through different systems under what limitations. Thinking about, and again, this again comes back to governance in some ways, is it's to be ready for what? And that's where I've got that idea of X ready. Is it research ready? Is it policy ready? Is it advocacy ready? I've worked with different groups to try and achieve different things. And the way you need to present and manage data differs for those purposes. And the user communities that are there for those can be quite different in terms of skills and capability as well. So at the level of the partner or the collection manager, what are you trying to enable, and what's the foundations there? The sorts of questions that come up on the technical considerations, and I kind of started to touch on this on those community collections, but it holds for big central stores as well. Where are you storing the data? Who's going to operate your infrastructure? How will people access your infrastructure? Who will determine authority to access the data? And a big one is, can or should users be able to take your data away? I know there's questions around do we need to keep data on country? Is it it is kind of one that say in some of the projects that we've done has been an important basis for discussion as well. So I think answering some of those, as a technology provider or a service provider, that needs to align back to your priorities in terms of ownership or custodianship, stewardship, depending on which form of responsibility you have there. But those choices really need to be aligned with back to your priorities and to that access for what. It's you're ready for what is X that you're trying to deal with there? Is it research? Is it advocacy and the like? I've lost focus there. So, and this is my next to last slide, basically, that there are, fundamentally, I've kind of walked through some of the design choices that are available to, different communities and different providers. But what IDN is really about is really a distributed set of collections and services here. So I just wanted to highlight, fundamentally what we will need to be thinking about is the breadth of and the dimensions on which this is likely to vary. So, the first being technology. A lot of the ADA's, well, all the ADA's collection sits on a very large the national computational, infrastructure, the largest supercomputer, in Australia. Is run by petabytes, and they talk about exabytes. If you're not sure what exabytes are, I can't tell you how many zeros there is there, but it's a very large scale, high volume operation. But that can go all the way. We're going to be dealing with all the way down to local hard drives. And that leads me to the second, which is really about geography. Geography matters here. For this, and how do we think about the this and communications from the inner city right through to out to a remote community? It's the theory of distance, but it's communications distance is really the implications there. So the follow on from that is the communications pipeline, and say that what we've learned from some of the technology solutions we've been trying out with our colleagues over the last couple of years is, even places where we would have thought communications was probably sound enough, it hasn't held up. Sort of 100 kilometres outside of Melbourne, just because of a lot of the way the digital services are provided really to rely upon internet, considerations. What do we, where is the redundancy built into thinking about, some of those communications technologies there? Sam Provost has, certainly has talked to me about, improving the level of communications within Jabiru, by turning up, with a particular, technology means, when he's been out doing field work. There are, this is a real thing, and how are we going to deal with that, and how do we accommodate? Say, because a lot of the services that currently exist really do rely on those communications technologies, and then the skills and capabilities of the different collections managers. We're going to be dealing with here everything from full-time paid staff, multiple staff, to volunteers working in their spare time. And there's going to be that wide range there. I'm in the privileged position of actually being able to rely upon a team of I have 10 people within my team at ADA, but I rely quite heavily on the NCI systems, which have 50 people running that computing facility. That's a very nice situation to have, but how do we deal with at the other end very low levels of resourcing and fundamentally a skills development sort of question. So and that's kind of the last point I sort of come to here, which is, we do need to be able to consider the means of building in redundancy and capacity building into the management of collections. And it comes across those four areas, as I say, those four choices that we've got here within our distributed collections, they're not independent, so, it's going to be the case that, we might have to think about, where do we host things? And this is a conversation for that is really governance driven as well. Hosting arrangements, support services. We have the capacity to share those across the network, but choices around where and how to house content do have implications. If you're going to keep content within a community, how do you sort of accommodate the sorts of skills and capabilities that are going to be needed to manage that that collection effectively? How do we build up sort of a set of capabilities over time to effectively do that? Do we have movement between different parts of the network? So ideally we can we can keep content on country, but how do we do that in a way that actually ensures that we preserve the collections that we're talking through? So I don't have my point is not there isn't one solution here, but allowing for variation in that over time, I think is going to be, and that's one of the values of I think the network itself here is to allow us to accommodate different levels of, readiness and, and experience, and progressively move towards what, back to my first, area on governance, move towards, the preferred model, for a given community and a given collection in the long term, but enabling support in the short to medium term through redundancy and capacity building over time. So, as I say, just to conclude, I think there's going to be lots of breadth of choices for network and partners. Understanding and accommodating those choices will be key to the effective functioning of the network as a whole, and for individual collections and organisations. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Steve. I wonder, there's a lot of very useful information on that slide in terms of practical and technical considerations. Some of that information be available to participants who could, particularly things around technical considerations. So some of those questions that you'd outlined might be helpful prompts around end users and community organisations trying to summarise and make information, I guess, concise around what's needed and what's required. Would you be happy to share that information?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm certainly happy to share anything I presented here. I mean, the presentation as it stands, or I will say to that is, this is kind of a reflection on learnings over time. I would say that the extent to which these are, kind of documented, this is just some starting points to think about sort of resources I think that need to be built up. And I would make that point because, as I say, we've learnt some of these things in the sorts of things that we've done, but as I say, it's really trying to bring together, here are some choices to be made. And I think as we go forward, and it's kind of prompting those sorts of considerations. But I think it would be very useful to build in those, where do we get resources to enable you to make choices around X? There, I think would be pretty helpful going forward. So, as a starting point, absolutely, I'm more than keen for that to go to everyone. But as I say, I wouldn't say I have answers, on each of those things. It's really reflections as much as anything.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. We'll open the question and comments up to the floor and online.
Stephanie here. Hi. Steve, hope you're enjoying Sweden there. Just a quick question. You talked about those community collections that you were working on, and obviously many of those have been project-based with, funding for a certain period of time. And I suppose my question goes to, what do you do about the long-term sustainability of those and the availability of those? Otherwise, they just become another project rather than, what's your advice and suggestions there? And a second question has to do around, you've provided all those considerations, that you can apply at potentially at different levels. And it goes back to the first question, if we've got multiple hundreds of communities who are wanting to create a system, a platform with that governance around it, how do you again make that sustainable? And how do you scale it, not necessarily in size, but because you're scaling potentially small collection space or larger collection space. So how do you scale that as well? Nice, easy question for you.
Yeah. No, let me answer that partly through the two reflections. So, the first one is, as I say, the Triple R project that's there. I mean, it is actually a good example of that exact situation that you were describing. So we have. We worked with colleagues at Melbourne to migrate, in fact, the service into the NCI systems from that they were based at the University of Melbourne, based on some technology that was developed by Gavin McCarthy in the East Scholarship Research Centre. Fundamentally, the ESRC was closing down, and we had to preserve the collection, as it was at that time, and in a sense keep it going. And we've been able to do that. But the technology itself is still kind of shaky, and there is a need for continual development of certain types of projects and services to reflect that. So I have direct experience of doing that. And this is also where we learned a little bit about some of the hosting arrangements and the distance arrangements, because as the way we organised it, we moved it into some virtual environments and tried to make it accessible out in I think it was the API lands, and simply the web interface to that, and that turned out to be challenging and just in terms of just redundancy of the communication. So there are challenges in even keeping things going of what you have. So I say again, we're kind of learning as we go on that, to some degree. The other reflection that I've had with that is actually this is a problem that's kind of been recognised particularly in the heritage and some of the digital humanities projects that exist, is sort of the proliferation of technologies and projects as a whole. And the cultural data engine is a new project, a LEAF project that's happening through LEAF, which is in a sense trying to think a little bit about those implications, which is it's nice to have bespoke services, and it's nice to have fit for purpose services. But there is actually Sandra, who I think is in the room, is a great. There's a technical debt that comes with that. Fundamentally, as you develop something new and you develop something bespoke, how do you support that going forward? And that has implications, just in terms of finding people to run those and manage those. So this is where actually sort of things that are already in play. You've kind of got to think: have I got a situation where I can keep them going, or do I want to be able to move them to something that is sustainable in the longer term? I think the way a lot of the infrastructure provision is going is say that increasingly generalized generic service technologies and services are good for that, but they're not necessarily great for a given project. So there's got to be some accommodation and some how do you deal with those compromises? And that's kind of why I put that list of questions on the table. There is I think there would be value across the network to say, choice is good, but too many, I think the thing I would say is too many choices actually leads to it's difficult to maintain the longer term set of collections and projects, as you say, Stephanie. So I think the reflection I'd make there is staying to this isn't a one best solution answer, but trying to target a small number of solutions that might support particular types of collections communities, so that you can concentrate the technical effort that comes for supporting those and concentrate the expertise to support those, would actually be a really valuable thing to be doing going forward. So that, as I say, we know that those projects have projects end. The infrastructures are designed to keep going, but the infrastructures have to be able to support the content that's come from those projects. So this is where the standards and alignments, trying to make some choices around kind of preferably a core set of types of approaches, and often that's aligned with the data types that I talked about before. I think would be a really valuable exercise to engage in, because it then allows us to think about, well, how do we deal with those long-term sustainability questions? Everyone doing entirely their own thing is good from a project level, but it is not great from a long-term sustainability of the network as a whole, because it's actually very hard to move between some of these systems quite often.
Thanks, Steve.
It's not a question, Steve, just a quick comment. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Nick.
Look, I just want to support that ex-purpose kind of notion that you had there. Often we hear about data quality, fit for this, fit for that. If you don't name the purposes and have different tests for different kinds of purposes, you go nowhere. I'm asked often about what is the metadata that's appropriate for this data quality. What quality? Quality for what? So quality for ... In this case, you listed a bunch of researchy kind of things. There might be Indigenous purposes that can be articulated. Does this data set have the right kind of metadata for potential return to custodians or something? So I really like that approach. We want to have, after we've done some roles modelling, to do some purpose modelling and then work out what we need to have confidence that the data is suitable for certain purposes.
Yeah, can I say, I might just quickly reflect on that a little bit more, Nick, which is to say, I mean, again, this comes from it comes from experience working with often a couple of projects where there's been both a community benefit and a research benefit, focus to it. Data that's needed for research doesn't look like data that's needed for community. As say, just as example, so understanding who needs access and what in what form is really helpful. Then allow us again to target the sorts of systems you might want to orient towards as well, and the access models you've got there. I know. I think the ABS is on the call here. There's a really nice profile of actually they've applied the 5 safes to the different types of access models that they have, but it's quite useful for thinking about we've got this type of interaction, and the reason for that type of service delivery is because it fits this particular types of needs, and it has this sort of risk profile. It's actually a very nice way of thinking, okay, I'm doing that because it supports that particular style of interaction with the data that people are interested in. So, just to reflect on that a little more.
G'day, Steve. Sam Proos here. This is kind of a question for you, but I think we've had this conversation as well, so also for the experts here. One of the things I've found collecting data on the ground, working with communities, is a growing sentiment about where that data lives in terms of, you were speaking about geography and infrastructure before. Anecdotally, working in Kakadu, talking to the Namar Rangers, and they're saying, data about Alligator River stays on Alligator River. What are the implications, I guess, from a large-scale infrastructure point of view, and what might we think about when we're thinking about developing infrastructure and capacity in community?
Yeah. So for everyone, Sam and I have talked about this, on and off, because this was really the prompt for those distributed, choices questions, fundamentally. And this is the question of, being on country and things staying on country is there, this isn't, what works and what doesn't, but what we have learned from, I run a centralized service, and that's good for certain sorts of things. But what it doesn't do that well is get, certainly some of the remote access laboratory models. We were, for example, working with the Triple R folks to provide a hosted remote access, so they could dial into a service. And do a lot of the curation work. So this was, to get it ready for others to be able to use. But the latency of the communications, just meant that it couldn't be done. So what we were trying to do was enable, sort of a service that happens, in Canberra, because we've got the computation. But this is where the communications really started to kick in. So it's the interaction of different layers of this. That was a prop. They wanted to get away from the case where they had multiple versions of databases occurring, had teams around the country, and they wanted to be able to bring the content together. And so, we could deal with the solution of putting everything in the same place so everyone could get access to it, to work collectively on it. But the implication was that you could only do it necessarily from certain sorts of places. And so we've adapted a little bit the model that we've got there to account for the communications systems that were available there. So it's actually more web-based than it was in the past. So a browser is easy to work with than something that requires you to have in a sense, a remote desktop to dial into a remote system. That just the communications, it works more effectively there. At the same time, what would be the implication of putting those things out in keeping things on country there? Well, and this is the message I sort of wanted to talk to in terms of having things stay on country, is that there are resource implications to that as well, which is you have to concentrate the expertise and the capability then in that particular local collection. Do you have the people who can work with the data locally? Do you have the IT support that's occurring there? If you want to, there's the other end of the communication side to this as well. If you if you'd like to enable that your data, your content to be accessible from elsewhere, how is it that someone's going to then get access to your collections? It's the same. It's just either ends of a pipeline fundamentally. In a sense, do you have to come on country in order to be able to access those? So these are choices you can make, but there are resource implications of them as well. So, is it a question of, and the conversation Sam and I have had is partly about, is it a question, and these are legitimate questions. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong here. Is it about the data being on country, or is it about maintaining ownership and custodianship of the content that's there? As I say, and that's a choice, that's kind of being made as well around governance. And again, you can sort of see argument. People will have arguments in either direction, and Aaron's nicely pointed out. Yes, the distributed model does have some resourcing implications there for making sure things are preserved, stored, maintained. That's why those, the communications, I think, is really an important part of this, because the backups, that you might want to be doing and be able to do do have to go through those communication systems more often than not, or you have to have a redundancy arrangement for your backups that's happening locally. And as I say, and this is not limited to remote communities, as well. It's the NCI that the large supercomputing folks that I mentioned before. It's a few years back, but they've been involved in the IPCC considerations, and they did tell me a story of so that involves shunting data and large volumes of data around the world, and their story was the best method of actually getting shunting those large collections from San Diego on the west coast of the US down to Canberra was someone on a plane with a stack of hard drives. That was still to say, by the time you sent things through the communication systems of the volumes they were talking about, it still made more sense to get on a plane, get there, and come back again. Now, I don't know if that's still the case, but they're scaling. This is where scale really starts to become challenging from their point of view. So, it doesn't. It's not. It's what can you fit through those internet pipes. Really does. It does matter.
Really interesting. I've got time for one more question. If there's anyone in the room or online that would like to ask Steve whilst he's here, any questions or comments?
Yeah, Steve, thanks very much for that excellent presentation. Okay, so I've come in our work. We've come across this problem. Can you answer this question? Recognise that I'm a dummy in this field. So we have lots of communities with all their data on stacks of hard drives, and they don't have enough internet to upload and download. So they really don't have any options. But if a cyclone went through a few of these buildings, they'd lose the lot. So one thing that just came up in discussion recently with one mob who've got decades of all their cultural material on hard drives and very cyclone-prone area is that we back up their data on a cloud and they keep their hard drives and their chunky internet connection and keep operating as they do, but we back it up on the cloud. Is that a solution?
It's still that those communication pipeline, just the volume of internet communication still is kind of a delimiting factor here, Marcia. The cloud, fundamentally depends upon having the interactions with the technology somewhere else, and that's often Google or Amazon, whoever are hosting these things in large scale centers. You've still got to be able to get them to those places. That said, that answer I was just talking about, it some mix of humans and technology might is probably the answer to that flying things on planes. I know it's fundamentally if the pipeline if the communications isn't there, it's going to be some other means of shunting things from one place to another to get that redundancy there. And look, as I say, I mean, there's plenty of IT providers who can certainly talk to this, much more effectively than I can, and there's sort of a lot of questions around. Yeah, I mean, so Aaron is kind of alluding to this, in the comments here. Is I think that's still going to be part of the conversation fundamentally. I'd be thinking about how you build that in. One of the things I put on, up is really picking upon, it would be really good to engage one of the communications providers, and Telstra's the obvious choice here, to be dealing with, to having a conversation about this, so that you could, I mean, that's literally where I would go. This isn't a question that's going to be solved. The communications is not going to be solved by anyone other than the communications provider, plus probably someone at the, possibly one of the big technology providers as well. And I know Troy Walsh is sort of, saying in the comments there, let's say, to me, it's a conversation with Telstra about long-term strategy, and then mitigating strategies in the short term. And let's say it probably is, people with hard drives on planes or, in cars, so that you've got those, fundamentally that redundancy happening in the short term, until you can get, in a sense, the automated version happening in the, in the medium to long term.
Thanks very much, Steve. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got a question from the floor.
Just a comment further to Marcia's question. People with data in remote communities, number one, the advice should be they need multiple copies of it. So whatever hard drives they've got, I mean, hard drives are pretty cheap. They need to replicate those, hopefully a couple of times, and then, as Steve said, it becomes possible to physically have it at some more central, perhaps your local regional area, where they might have contact with educational institutions who are on ARNet, and where, as Marcia suggests, a backup copy for disaster recovery purposes can be held in the cloud and gotten there where the facilities are in place to do a network copy. So something like that. Difficulties come when how often the data is being updated and so on. So I think, these are solvable problems, but remoteness is an issue. But it comes down to having multiple physical copies in different locations.
Yeah. I'll reinforce that. I mean, there's a technology, literally, it's called LOCKSS, but I think it's the principle that actually is the really important one here. LOCKSS stands for lots of copies keeps stuff safe. I mean, that's literally where they came up with the acronym from. And I think, as a preservation principle, and as there are others who are much better at this than me, that's a good guiding principle. But progressively you can move from the principles to the practice and the technical solutions following on from that. But we do need the that to kind of work in that way. I'll just say one other interesting sort of reflections on the communications side is there is, as I say, I think Telstra and the like are part of the solution here. But we did actually have a conversation with the Ramsay Foundation about 18 months ago about some of these sort of interesting sorts of questions, and the First Nations portfolio at ANU was involved in this. But I would just make the point that the outgoing head of the Paul Ramsay Foundation is now the incoming head of PM&C, and so there might actually be an opportunity to have a more serious discussion about that. Glyn Davis is open to this sort of thinking, seems to me. So
Thanks,
I'll just reflect on that.
Excellent. Before we go to an afternoon tea break, we had a virtual hand raise. Troy Walsh from VATCHO. Did you have a comment or question, Troy, before we break for afternoon tea?
Maybe not a question, more a statement. So I used to work at Telstra before joining Batch, I was at Telstra for 29 years, and I played in the transport and IP space. I also played in the data and automation solution space, and we worked with things called software-defined networks. I did send a long-winded email to everyone, so I need to apologise for my ramble. But it was really sort of along the points of what Steve's making. There's a real strong need for investment in underlying infrastructure. I guess the telco and ICT infrastructure needs to be strong investment there, and there are solutions to these problems. You start talking around things like wavelength technology, where you can have flex grid sort of wavelengths that run at 100 or 200 gig. They're meshed, they're software defined. They have layer 0 and layer 1 switching on them, so photonic, optical and Ethernet switching, and also the ability to ramp up because they're software defined. You can ramp up, so you could potentially ramp someone's gig E connection up to a 10 gig E, so they can do their data downloads over the weekend and things like that. It is very much front and center of my mind because we at the moment have some of our members that are on 20-year-old copper technology, and they are offline more than they are online. The Australian Digital Health Agency wants us to talk about, digital health, virtual consult, telehealth, My Health Record, all that stuff, which is fantastic, but they don't get to play in that space. And for me, I really like an Aboriginal Indigenous health network that did look at fibering places up. Now, one of our members, Budja, they're in the Grampians, 250 kilometres from Melbourne, 27 kilometres from Stawell. Yet, there's a fibre out to Halls Gap. I know that because I have friends that still work at the company, and I ask them. And there are vacant fibres. So the investment to probably fibre up a community ACO might, let's say, cost $100,000, and people go, $100,000, but that's in for 25 years. So you look at it over 25 years, it's $4,000 a year, but then they can actually play, and that's where the need is greatest. So I think we really need to have this kind of discussion, and we really need to look at this. So access, trying to make sure we don't have holes in our data. The underlying infrastructure is, right to sort of support not only now, but 10 years into the future, not putting Band-Aid solutions on or piecemealing things, that we try and put something in place. And you look at the public health network, I guarantee they have a fully meshed big pipe network that allows huge volumes of data to go from one to the other. We need to get to that space. And the requirement's probably not as big, but there is a requirement there. So, read my email, and I 100% agree with Steve. So, yep.
Thank you. Thanks, Troy, for those insights.
Yeah, I might just jump in. Troy, just wanted to kind of confirm and reach out. Sorry. Just wanted to kind of reach out and confirm. Are you happy for us to extend that on to the rest of the participants?
Absolutely.
I think the email thread that you sent it through to Cobb, I think it only had a portion of them. But if you're happy for us to forward that on so everyone can have a read through that and digest that, because it was such critical feedback and very central to this. I guess, my previous history as well, working alongside Troy, and both Nairi as well, know all too well what that's like in the community control health sector, and very much talking, I think, the need to match parity with those other counterparts. So, no, it's really great. Thank you so much for that contribution. We genuinely appreciate it.
Thank you.